Well, hello everybody, this is Jason Howell, and on behalf of ASAP, TAAP, and RecoveryPeople, I would like to welcome you to our first in a series of advocacy webinars. This is all part of our ABCs of Advocacy kind of march towards Recovery Day at the Capitol. And so let me scroll down here. And I'm very excited. First up on our agenda, we have a guest speaker. If you attended the ABCs of Advocacy training here a few weeks ago, you heard from Duane. But Duane Galligher is a partner with the Texas Strategy Group, and he is the lobbyist for both ASAP and TAAP. And if you remember the last time we were together at ABCs, that it was the day before the November 6th election. And so it was a very dynamic election, and Duane's going to give us kind of an overview of some of the results and what that might mean for our advocacy action plans. So Duane, I'm going to go ahead and pull your slide deck up into the room. Hopefully you can see it there, and just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay, great. Thanks. Appreciate everyone joining on this webinar. As Jason mentioned, it was a very, very interesting election. A lot of times, to be honest, in the last 15 years or so that I've been really analyzing the elections, not as a participant running one of the campaigns, which I used to do, but just as an observer, you kind of had a good sense going in what how things were going to turn out, but that really wasn't the case this time. We had a lot of interesting races, and I want to talk about some of those. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm only seeing it very small. Is that how it's showing up for everyone else?
Let's see here. Maybe I can swap. Is that better or not?
There, that's it. Perfect.
That's it? Okay.
So the big story with this election was turnout, without question. We had a turnout of 8.3 million votes. That's up from 4.7 million the last time we had a midterm in 2014, and I believe we were at 4.9 million in 2010. So it was just astronomical. We saw this in early voting. We had a good sense that we were going to have a record high turnout, but nobody knew exactly what that meant and whether it was just perhaps people voting earlier and not showing up on election day, which there was some of that. But to put this in perspective, usually you have about half to 2/3 of vote on a midterm versus a presidential year. The 8.3 million votes were the most we've had in any presidential election except 2016 when there were 8.9 million votes. So that was really the story, and we'll see kind of what the impact was of that. Next slide. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please.
If you're not speaking, if you could please put your audio on mute. We're hearing some background noise.
Okay, so the statewide elections, the big story, of course, and if you had a TV on in the last 60 days before the election, was, back one slide, excuse me, was Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke. Cruz narrowly won 2.6% statewide. That is the closest statewide race in Texas since 1998, when we had two races that were very close. One was then Agriculture Commissioner Rick Perry winning the Lieutenant Governor's race. This really, I think, is going to be the question that we have, and I've got a few slides at the end. What does all this mean going forward? But is this the new normal? Is Texas a competitive state? And if so, how did it become a competitive state? We've all heard for, the last 10 or 15 years that demographics were trending in the Democrats' favor, but this was a giant leap forward. And really it was, I think, a reflection of Trump not being as popular with Republicans in Texas as he is with Republicans in other parts of the country. We've just seen a lot of changes in the numbers, and people forget because Trump won the presidential election in 2016, he actually did worse than McCain or Romney did in Texas. So his brand of republicanism that's played well, I think, in the Midwest and in some Rust Belt states is not as popular in Texas, and he was without a doubt a drag on the ticket. But you did see about 1 in 10 voters, if you go through these numbers, voted for Greg Abbott for governor, and then voted for Beto O'Rourke for Senate. That's just the way the math plays out. And it is telling that there were a significant number of people who split their ticket. You see the other 3 races I mentioned on here, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who was really attacked by the public education community, Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's had some ethics issues, and Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller, who's had a number of bad press moments over his 4 years in office. They were all very close races, 3 to 5%. When you just had a generic, no-name judicial candidate down further on the ballot, they were winning by 7 to 9 points. So you can see that voters consciously were voting Republican, but not voting for a handful of people. And in fact, you've already had Senator Kel Seliger from Amarillo has stated in the press, I intend to have a conversation with Lieutenant Governor about why it is that 10% of people are voting for Greg Abbott that won't vote for Dan Patrick, and what policies the people of Texas have a problem with. Pretty interesting. Next slide, please. So the Texas House, I think I told some of you that we were expecting some big changes there. That ended up happening. If you'll look at the numbers here, last session we had a 95-55 Republican majority. That's that's a pretty dominating majority. You need 100 votes for a few things, but not many. Most everything in the House is done with a simple majority. Now, after the election, Democrats picked up 12 seats. I think they would have been giddy with 10. 12 was some surprises. There were some they lost that they were certainly targeting, but they did about as well as anyone had predicted. Although I'd heard the number that 15 could be in play. And if you look at the results, if they had done 2 or 3% better across the board, they really would have picked up probably close to 20. There were a number of other really close races that Republicans weren't really thinking they were in danger of losing, and they ended up being competitive. Next slide. Okay, there were, of these 12 seats, I just wanted to run through these so some of you who live in these areas will know that you've got a new legislator to talk to. They really center in 3 areas. You got Central Texas, Dallas area, and the Houston area. Just to kind of start through these in order, Aaron Zwiner won the open seat that's Hays County based that Jason Isaac had. Vicki Goodwin won the adjoining seat. It's actually where I live. That was Paul Workman. That's Travis County, but it's southwest, kind of Travis County in the expanding suburbs. That has been a pretty Republican area, but the vote against Trump and for Beto in that area just was overwhelming. HD 52 is Williamson County. That's the Round Rock area. That was Larry Gonzalez's seat. Has been safe Republican for the last 20 years. In HD 65, this to me is the biggest surprise of the night. I didn't know anyone that had this on a list of competitive races. This is Denton County, which has been a traditional 70% Republican county. Ron Simmons, who was actually being mentioned as a potential speaker's candidate, was defeated by Michelle Beckley. I don't know much about Michelle, but she has my favorite profession of anyone that was elected to the House this time. She is an exotic bird store owner. HD 102, Anna Maria Ramos. This is Dallas County. Coop was a moderate, but she was very nervous and kind of, I think, half expected that she would get swept out. Terry Meza, also Dallas County, but more on the west side. That was Rodney Anderson's seat. Next slide. Retta Bowers, East Dallas County. Cindy Burkett had vacated that seat to run for Senate. There was some talk that she thought even challenging an incumbent senator, she had a better chance of being in the legislature than getting reelected in her seat. It was one where the demographics were trending against her. HD 114 is a little more surprising. This was a seat that Jason Villalba held, who was kind of a moderate Republican. He was challenged and defeated in the primary by someone that was supported by the Tea Party. And then they ultimately couldn't hold the seat. John Turner, who is the son of a former congressman from East Texas, overwhelmingly won that seat. Again, also Dallas County. HD 115, again, Dallas County. Julie Johnson really, I think, beat Matt Rinaldi, who is a far right-wing Tea Party member, by about 15 points. HD 132 and 135, both Harris County seats. These were a little surprising. I don't think many people thought that they would be the most likely seats in Harris County to flip, but they did. Gina Kalani beat Mike Schofield, and then John Rosenthal beat Gary Elkins. Elkins has been in the legislature for over 20 years. Schofield had just served a couple of terms, but both of these were trending against the Republicans. There was another race that they just finished a recount yesterday, and Duane Galligher was reelected by less than 40 votes. And then HD 136, this is the result of redistricting. It's not in the right number order, and as far as where it is in the states, but that's also Williamson County, north of Austin. And that one, John Busey overwhelmingly beat Tony Dale. And if you're keeping score, that means in central Texas, so Austin and the surrounding counties to the north and south, there are no Republicans left. Every Travis County seat and every Williamson County and Hays County seat have now gone to the Democrats, which is a pretty marked change. Next slide. Okay, so this just gives you some perspective of where these races are. And I think this is interesting because when you have 12 seats, you kind of think, well, there's been a major, kind of statewide shift. But what we've really seen is the shift is happening at a very rapid rate in very particular areas. Central Texas was 4 of the seats. Dallas County alone was 5 of the 12 seats, and they almost had 2 more that flipped. If any of you are familiar with Dallas, Highland Park is about as, when you think of the stereotypical Republican area, that's about what you think of in your mind. And that area, I think the Republican was reelected by a fraction of a percent. There were, like I said before, a Democrat win in Denton County, and they came close to winning in several Collin County and Tarrant County races. That's just, a marked change, because those were the kind of the basis and the bedrock of Republican advances in Texas statewide over the last 30 years. It was because of growth in the very Republican suburbs. What we're seeing now are that the urban areas and suburbs are decidedly purple. But at the same time, areas that were kind of mixed in the past, rural Texas, those are now overwhelmingly Republican. So when you've seen Texas shift maybe overall, 6, 7, 8 points towards the Democrat side over the last 20 years, it's not that that's been the same rate of shift across the state. Rural areas have gotten even more Republican. Urban areas and suburban areas have gotten much more Democratic. I did mention there was one bright spot for Republicans. Representative Sarah Davis won re-election. That was the district in which Hillary Clinton did the best of any of the 95 that were held by Republicans. So just based on math, she should have been the first one to fall. She's a very outspoken moderate and kind of forged her own path. And it's always interesting to me when you see these super high turnout years. She was able to really get her message out that she is not a Trump Republican. She is different from a lot of the others on the ballot, and she did well. Same with Congressman Will Hurd, who's got a district that starts in San Antonio and kind of stretches southwest from there. He's a very moderate Republican member of Congress and was able to win in a district that the numbers said should have favored a Democrat. In the Senate, you didn't see that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Next slide. Okay, well, before we go to the Senate, let's talk about the speaker. We will have a new speaker. As I've mentioned before, Joe Strauss was retiring, but he had announced that over a year ago, and a lot of candidates had thrown their hat in the ring, and I think at one point 12 or 14 names were being mentioned. That got wrapped up on Monday of this week. Speaker Pro Tem and Ways and Means Chairman Dennis Bonnen had a press conference in which he released the names of 109 members that had pledged to support him. And then all the other candidates have since officially withdrawn from the race. The 109 names is far more than the 76 he needs. And he also notably released more than 76 Republicans on that list. All but 5 Republicans were among the 109, and then about half the Democrats. And there's thoughts that he could have gotten more and probably will get 150 votes on the first day of the session, but he just put the list out before it was complete. If you guys will recall, the current speaker, Joe Strauss, has really been targeted since his election 10 years ago from the Tea Party and far right-wing elements. And the basis of their critique has been that he was elected with a majority of Democratic support. Whether or not that's 100% accurate, that kind of was the critique against them. What's interesting about Dennis Bonnen is, he is much more conservative than Strauss, just from a philosophical and voting record standpoint. But he was also one of Strauss's closest lieutenants throughout his time in office. In fact, he was so closely aligned to Strauss that Empower Texans, which is a kind of Tea Party activist group that challenges a lot of Republicans they perceive as too moderate, actually spent $80,000 trying to beat Dennis Bonnen in the primary this year. They were unsuccessful, and now they're claiming victory with his election as speaker, because he is more conservative from a pure voting record standpoint than some others. But Bonnen has been around for a long time. He was elected when he was, I believe, 24 years old, and has served about half his adult life, or half his entire life, excuse me, in the Texas House. So he is a bit of a bulldog. Personality-wise, he couldn't be more different than Strauss. Strauss is a very nice, somewhat soft-spoken person. If you've seen Dennis Bonnen at the dais, someone likened him to the designated driver at a frat party. He's kind of not tolerating any nonsense from a lot of the members, and I think that the House wanted someone who would stand up to the Senate, given their confrontational nature in recent years, and Bonnen will certainly do that. Next slide. So in the Senate, we also had some Democrat pickups. Just to talk a little bit more, there's 3 elements here. So there's 31 members total of the Senate. Republicans had 20 last session. If you'll recall, you need 19 to bring a bill to the floor because of the 3/5 rule. So the Republicans had a 1-vote margin. Then, because of Carlos Uresti's new home and federal penitentiary, he resigned his office, and Republicans actually won a Democrat seat based out of San Antonio. They increased their margin to 21, but then they lost 2 seats this election. This is probably a bigger loss for Republicans because these are 4-year seats, and it will be, it'll take a longer time for them to make this up. So right now, the Republicans have 19. You need 19 votes to bring things to the floor. It shouldn't be a problem, right? Well, the issue is Kel Seliger from Amarillo, and I think I mentioned this to some of you before, but he is decidedly more moderate. In fact, the Lieutenant Governor, at least behind the scenes, was pretty open in trying to defeat Kel Seliger in the primary. So there's no love lost between the Lieutenant Governor and Seliger. Seliger is also outspoken against several of Patrick's pet projects, including property tax caps that would apply to cities and counties. He doesn't want to hamstring his largely rural district. So Seliger is suddenly the most important member of the Texas Senate, without doubt, really, as far as getting the votes necessary to advance something that's even remotely controversial. Next slide. The 2 Democratic pickups in the Senate were both in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. SD 10, this is the old Wendy Davis seat. When she ran for governor, Connie Burton was elected to that seat. Now Beverly Powell, who's a former school board member, will have that for at least the next 4 years. And notably, the lines will be redrawn by the next time we have an election for these Senate seats. In SD 16, Nathan Johnson defeated Don Huffines. Both of those incumbent Republicans were Empower Texans far-right candidates. So these will demonstrably shift the philosophical makeup of the Senate. And again, it puts a razor-thin margin to bring up anything without moderate and even Democrat support. Also, in 2 years, you're going to have the Pete Flores seat, which I mentioned before was a pickup from Carlos Uresti, but that will be one that the Democrats are favored to pick up. So in all likelihood, you've got a 19-12 Republican-Democrat makeup this session, and you will probably have an 18-13 makeup the session after that, barring something unusual happening. Next slide.
I'm hearing the whistling in the background, so if you're not speaking, please put your computer and your phone on mute. Thank you.
So just a reminder, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, he's essentially the Speaker of the Senate. It's a very powerful position. He appoints the committee chairman, controls the flow of legislation. Patrick is very conservative. He's an unashamed Tea Party Republican, was a big supporter of Trump's. He was very influential last session and essentially forced our special session over several issues. And as I've mentioned to many of you before, we saw a lower percentage of bills passed of those introduced in any session since the 1800s. And this was directly attributable to the dysfunction between the House and Senate. Patrick has been very gracious in reaching out to Bonin publicly, congratulating him for his election as Speaker and wanting to work with the House. It remains to be seen, how this will continue. Just as institutions, the House and Senate structurally always have friction. The governor last session really tended to side more with the Senate, and there was a lot of debate and speculation over whether that was politics or whether that was policy. There was a lot of rumblings towards the end of last session that Patrick was going to challenge Abbott and actually run for governor. That certainly won't be the talk this time around, with Abbott doing so much better in the election than Patrick. But I think it remains to be seen exactly how everything will play out, given that we have a new speaker. He is more conservative, but I mean, he is, like I said before, a much stronger personality. And he is not one that will, I think, go quietly and cower under Patrick's kind of bombastic personality. So it will be very interesting. Next slide. So what are we looking at for getting ahead of ourselves 2020? Well, I mentioned that because I think that the 2020 elections are going to be on people's mind as we go into the next legislative session, more so than they normally would be. And that's really because the map was so dramatically redrawn. You had places like Collin County, Plano, the North Austin suburbs, Williamson County, which has always been very Republican. They're suddenly in play now. I think there will be some debate about whether this is a Trump vote and whether Trump will continue to be a drag on the rest of the Republicans in some of these urban and suburban areas, or whether it was just Beto O'Rourke's campaign, whether this was an anomaly because of the high turnout. But it's going to dramatically change, I think, how some of these elections work and how people govern in Texas. I think there are some that have been outspoken that Republicans have to do something. What they're doing and all the trends are going against them in Texas, and they need to figure out a way to reach some of these educated suburban voters who are flying away from the party in droves. But we know where the battlegrounds will be. It's going to be Dallas, Houston, Central Texas. You have some Collin County seats that were very close that will be contested. I think Republicans will try to go on the offense and win back some of these seats. Just to give you an indication of how fast this is turning, Tarrant County was viewed by many as kind of the litmus test for any statewide race. It has voted Republican, just election after election since at least the 90s, which is as far back as the numbers that I have up on my screen. These are areas where George W. Bush was winning by 25, 30 points. And now Beto O'Rourke actually won Tarrant County. Now, the reason that the Democrat hasn't won statewide is what's happening in the smaller counties. In the smallest 239 counties, you went from the Republican getting 55% of the vote in 1996, up to closer to 70% of the vote, even in this last election. So it's very much a difference of what's happening in the biggest 15 counties and what's happening in the other 239 counties. But We do know that a lot of this is going to shake out and impact how we do redistricting, which is just around the corner. Republicans have been able to kind of shore up their districts and maintain a majority after redistricting just due to the geography of where these districts are. But that's working against them next time around, just due to so much more of their votes being concentrated in rural areas that are going to have less representation. So all this said, I think you're going to walk into a much different building this session than the Capitol you visited last session. It's going to be much closer in partisan makeup. Democrats will have more influence, and I think Republicans will understand that what they have been doing, at least with Trump as the leader of the party, has not been resonating, and they've been losing ground. And I really think you'll see a more pragmatic approach on some major issues. And probably some scared legislators who are afraid that they may not be back if things don't change at the top of the ticket. So that's it for my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I don't know how we're doing on time, but we can go to the next speaker.
Oh no, Duane, that was probably the best overview of the election results I've heard. I learned a lot, and it was very insightful. Definitely welcome. For those of you that have put yourself on mute, if you have a question for Duane, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, Duane, this is Sherry. I have a question about, you said it said, will Trump continue to be a drag on Texas Republicans?
Right.
And, what you heard so much in the media, at least what I heard so much of in the media, was that, Trump has a very strong following here. Cruz was very strong, was very focused on getting him here to boost Cruz's chances. Was that just hype, or was?
Well, so statewide, I mean, Trump did carry the state. He won by 9 points, but that's worse than any Republican that's run for president since at least Bob Dole. So, when I say drag, Trump will probably win Texas if, in a re-election. Texas just hasn't been competitive. But in some of these key areas that have been very Republican, like Sarah Davis's district, I forget the exact number, but that's a district that's been reliably sending a Republican to the legislature, but the demographics of it are just a complete opposite of where Trump's sweet spot is. It's educated urban voters, and that's an area where it's been Republican for years, but Hillary Clinton's getting 70% of the vote there in the last election. So when I say a drag, I don't necessarily mean statewide, although Trump's numbers are worse than any Republicans have been in Texas from a statewide standpoint, at least a presidential candidate. But Republicans have just really had to swim upstream when you're trying to win in places, like the Austin suburbs or Dallas or Houston, where, Trump just hasn't been popular. I'll give you one other example of that, because I just think this is an amazing statistic. In 1996 in Collin County, which is the Plano area in North Dallas, Bob Dole got 69% of the vote there. George W. Bush, when he was running, was getting 74, 75% in his presidential campaigns. Ted Cruz, this last election, just got 53%. 53-47 is very close, and it affected all of those races down the ballot. So you have these areas that have traditionally been Republican that are just looking like they're not going to be anymore. Now, on the flip side, in those small rural counties, Dole was getting 55%, and now Cruz is getting 70%. So you've seen a flip, and I mentioned that when the overall state numbers are moving kind of slowly, but you're seeing a really rapid move in both directions, depending on where you're looking, and that will certainly reshape the map and put a lot of seats in play.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess, I don't know what our population balance is between those urban counties that you're talking about and the rural and the 200 plus other, rural counties, but, it's only so long that the rural areas can carry the urban stuff, I guess.
Yeah, well, I can tell you what the numbers are. So in 96, the biggest 15 counties made up 60% of the vote. In the last election, they made up 67% of the vote. So it's shifting, maybe not as dramatically as you might think, but the rural counties are having less and less of the state's population, and that means when we do redistricting, they get less representation. Really, the urban areas too have kind of maxed out because you've seen a lot of development stall. The growth is in the suburbs, and if Republicans have always kind of relished the fact that the areas that are the fastest growing are mostly Republican areas. But now those areas that were 75% Republican are now suddenly 55% Republican, and that's a wake-up call to some people. South Texas is also growing, and I'll just mention briefly, if you had a game plan.
Computer on mute.
Yeah. If you had a game plan for Beto, he succeeded what he needed to do in a lot of areas. Tarrant County, Dallas, the suburbs, Austin. Where he really underperformed was in the rural area, where he made no improvement over what Trump had done, what Hillary Clinton had done in 2016. And then in South Texas, you didn't see the same increase in turnout as you did in the other parts of the state, and that really was tough for O'Rourke to overcome.
So I have a question. Hi, this is Selena Latham, MHMR, Tarrant County. As you were speaking to Beto about Beto, what do you think he could have done differently? Did he do a lot of campaigning in those rural areas?
He did. That's a very good question, because there were already some articles written nationally that Beto blew his opportunity because he didn't run to the middle. That he didn't try to run a campaign that kind of matched Texas voters. I don't know if I agree with that or not, because he, without question, he ran the most traditional kind of progressive campaign as far as policies and positions, and he still did better than any Democrat has done in 20 years. So it's hard for me to fault him for that. If I say this as someone who's worked in politics and so maybe I'm a little biased, but his reluctance to use pollsters and consultants, that can help you with just some of the mechanics of it, like targeting, understanding, where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in messaging. I thought some of his decisions were a little questionable, but his game plan was increased turnout across, among his supporters, and that was his path to victory. It was not trying to persuade, people who were traditional voters to change their mind and vote for someone else. And if you look at turnout, it certainly was driving a lot of people to the polls. If there's something that he needed to have happen, it's unquestionably to me that he needed South Texas to turn out, in higher numbers, just like the rest of the state did. And I don't know why he didn't resonate there. But he didn't do well in the primaries there, and people kind of attributed that to someone with a Hispanic last name running against him and not spending a lot of money. But he didn't really do that well in the general, comparatively. So that would be my, I guess, I'm not really answering the question. I don't really know what he could have done to win, but he was close enough that there's probably something he could have done. But I still think he ran a remarkable campaign, all things considered.
Thank you.
Duane, this is Cynthia.
Yes, ma'am.
Duane?
Yep.
With your crystal ball there sitting on your desk, what do you think with the new speaker, what happens with committee chairs? Do you have any guess for some of the key committees for our issue?
Oh, gosh. I think some of that will start leaking out. What's interesting is, more so than any speakers change, at least in the last 30 years, this is kind of a voluntary transition from one regime to another that's still really affiliated. It's a lot of the same people. I mean, Bonham was the speaker pro tem under Strauss, for 3 of his 5 sessions. So I don't think you will have as much of a reshuffling of the deck as you normally see. For example, Charlie Guerin, he's been one of Strauss's key lieutenants, is kind of behind the scenes, but he's been a big negotiator with the Senate, chairs the administration committee. Guerin was having dinner with Bonham last night, I know, and just hired, Bonin just hired as his chief of staff, Gavin Massengill, who's been a lobbyist the last several sessions, but before that was Charlie Guerin's chief of staff. So again, these, the worlds are kind of intertwined. There are some, rumors of some people who probably are not going to be in as good of shape as they were before. I think a lot of people who are out running for speaker, there's a chance that they may not be in good shape unless they, I'll just mention one, Travis Clardy. He was running for speaker, and he was one of the 5 Republicans that did not endorse Bonin when the list of names came out. I don't think he's in a good spot, to be honest. But
right.
There's a lot of time for things to reshape. We care a lot about appropriations. I think there's a good to great chance that John Zerwas stays there. He withdrew pretty early from the speaker's race, and he did endorse Bonin, and he's has certainly indicated that that's where he wants to remain. So I don't see a likely change there, but I think you probably will see some some reshuffling and changing of priorities. There was a rumor that Bonin had told people that to placate kind of some of the far right criticisms, that he would not appoint Democrat chairman, but he only answered, I think, 3 questions at his press conference, and one of them was related to that. He said he would continue the bipartisan traditions of the House. So I think you'll see something pretty similar to what we have now. Usually this kind of the committees are appointed somewhat in proportion to the makeup of the House. So I think you may see Democrats pick up a few chairmanships, maybe on things like transportation or criminal justice related. But I think it's a little early to really try to pick out things like calendars, chairs, and so on, or public health. I mean, Ford Price could move somewhere different. I think he would probably have some options, or you could see him stay there. So it still remains to be seen.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Duane? Duane, I have one. So, like on the timeline. So, what happens next? When is the speaker officially chosen? When does he choose the committees? Just to kind of help us understand what's going to unfold over the next couple of months.
Yeah, great question. So the speaker is officially elected on the first day of the session. So whatever that is, January 7th, whatever that Tuesday is, that's when he will officially be selected. But unofficially, I think it's over, and Bonin is the speaker. So he will be working to transition in and have meetings with legislators. The Senate always moves at a much faster pace, and Patrick has kind of made a point of appointing committee chairs early to allow them to start working. The House moves more slowly, partially because the House will have to adopt its rules, which will, the Speaker has a lot of influence in that, but it is a members-driven thing, and they will reshape some of the committees. So the committees are officially created in the rules, and that's usually adopted the 3rd or 4th day of session, sometimes the second week. Then you usually have another month or so before committees are actually appointed in the House. So I don't think you'll see anything until February. There's also the limitation that they can't really consider bills on the floor until the 61st day of the session. So I think the thinking in the House is, why get in a huge rush to appoint committees and have hearings when we can't debate anything until March anyway. There is an exception for emergency items, but that's kind of the thinking and rationale behind it. So I think you'll see things move pretty slow, methodically. Strauss certainly employed this tactic. Bonin may want to shake it up and do things a little differently. But I think that stalling and kind of pushing things to deadline has been a deliberate tactic in the House before, and I would expect it to continue until I'm proven otherwise.
So given that, what can we be doing now, like between now and it sounds like maybe February, March? What's the best utilization of our time and energy?
So the budget process does start a little more quickly. We have agency hearings. The biggest thing is getting to know these legislators, particularly given how much turnover we've had. We've had a Republican wave a couple of sessions ago and now a Democrat wave. So you have a lot of new members who haven't been exposed to this issue. And I think I've told Cynthia and others that I've been working with you for the last 11 years or so. But before this, I was at the Public Health Committee. And when I was there, I didn't even know about how the block grant system worked or how we fund substance use treatment and prevention programs when I was a staffer up there, ostensibly with jurisdiction over that issue. So don't assume that legislators and their staff will know these things. But the important thing is just develop those relationships and become the resource that those legislators go to on these issues. That's really important, and legislators love to have someone in their district that they talk to. So, make yourself known, become that resource, and then start formulating what your asks are, what your requests are, and your agenda. This always, it seems like you're waiting and waiting, and then things move very, very quickly. So it's important to have those relationships in place so that when legislation starts moving, you know who to go to, and you've already developed a contact that you can then turn on.
One last call for questions for Duane. Anybody?
This is Sherry. I have one more. I just got back from Washington, D.C., and one of the things that was discussed up there was, the emphasis on state lawmakers, but also the governor's office, and making sure that key people in the governor's office know what we do as providers. And I'm just wondering kind of what your thoughts are, and if you agree with that, who would you kind of identify in that office to be some kind of key targets?
Yeah, it's a great point. The governor will have some policy people in place. I think he's still hiring some of the health and human services people, or in their division of labor is changing, because I know that some have moved on since the last session. The governor, pretty much up and down, he's got a new team in place from the last session, from chief of staff to policy director. There's been a bit of a reorganization there. John Caliandro is someone who will be very influential. Luis Saenz is his new chief of staff. Those are both very important players. Walter Fisher is legislative director, another good person to know. But I think this governor has been very hands-off. So while you may see other states where policy is being driven out of the governor's office, I think the governor will have 4 or 5 key issues that he talks about, and then everything else we'll evaluate it if the legislature chooses to send it to us. So I think you can accomplish most of what you want to accomplish by working through the legislature, but it is always good to keep them aware of what you're working on and keep them informed. But it's probably not as driven by the governor's office as it would be in other states.
Thank you.
Well, Duane, I just want, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for your wisdom, your wealth of information, and helping us kind of break down and understand this historic election, and get a better understanding of what we can be doing here until session and then during session. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we've got about 15 minutes before the top of the hour, and as we talked about ABCs of advocacy, many of you developed your advocacy action plans, what you were going to be doing after the ABCs of advocacy training. And so we want to give everyone an opportunity, well, maybe not everyone, we have 15 minutes, so while we have time left, really hear from people. How's that going? What have you been doing since ABCs of advocacy? And give you an opportunity to kind of pat yourself on the back. So if you would like to report out, unmute your line and let's hear from you.
Okay, since you twisted my arm, this is Carl.
Hi, Carl.
Okay, since ABCs of Advocacy, we have Recovery People has a bill It's being sponsored by Rep Manjarez. She'll be sponsoring it on recovery housing volunteer certification. It's already being drafted, and Rep Moody's office is going to sponsor another bill for us to develop an interim report to look at the landscape of recovery housing in Texas. And after, and a lot of my work over the next couple of weeks will be visiting the freshman members to introduce myself as a resource for them in my bandwidth. That's my report.
Well, thanks, Paul. And to help people understand, so first of all, that's great. I mean, not one, but two bills that representatives have agreed to sponsor. How did that happen? Can you talk about the process of having a concept, going to the offices, and how did all that transpire?
Well, first, we had to develop our organizationally. We looked at our legislative priorities. We said what they were, and then we went about visiting different representatives to see who would sponsor a bill. We educated them on the issue and why the issue was important. Rep Manjarez, because of her interest in recovery housing, decided to sponsor the bill. After we talked to her legislative director wrote up a bill analysis, submitted it to the rep, and she said, yes, I will sponsor this bill. When we went to Rep Moody's office, it kind of unearthed itself in the discussion. His legislative director, Jennifer, said we may not be the persons to sponsor this particular bill, but we're big on writing reports. And so we said, all right, well, then we need a report. We submitted some information from Ohio, who did in 2013, they did a scan, and we needed something similar because that information, based on the GAO report, there's not that much information about recovery housing in the state of Texas. So it's an ideal item for the sessions that will be coming up. So that was the process, and that's now in drafting also. So
thanks for that, Carl. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody else on the line? Any? Have you reached out to your senators or representatives?
Carl, this is Cynthia.
Hi, Cynthia.
Ma'am.
I was wondering, when you went in, if you could share how you actually approached them for writing a bill. Did you bring them a draft, kind of a sample bill, or did you highlight points that were in the legislation you wanted covered? Maybe you could go over exactly how the bill came about.
Well, okay. The bill came about based on the legislative priorities of RecoveryPeople, which is the voluntary certification of recovery housing across the state to facilitate best practices. Jason and I developed one-pagers. We got information from, there was a toolkit, and Jason, please help me, who was the co-writer of the toolkit.
And the National Council on Behavioral Health, which ASAP, I believe, is a member of. So
right.
So we began to facilitate giving them as much help as possible. The toolkit provided sample legislations that are happening in other states. In our discussions, we gave the legislative director examples of what was going on in other states and how Texas was lagging behind in that conversation. And so as we began to educate them, they became very aware that there was a need for such a bill in the state of Texas. So we provided them as much information we could. My personal experience as a recovery person, a person in long-term recovery who is living in a recovery house helped. I was able to get my
if someone can mute, I can't even hear Carl.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of background noise in whatever room you're in, Carl.
Yeah, I'm at C4R, and everything's going on behind me. I'm sorry. And so I gave my personal experience as a person living in a recovery house and a person in recovery, how that supported my continued sustained recovery, and how important that went across very, very well. They saw, I'm an example of a person living in a recovery house. So with all of the information that we were able to give them from the written documentation, from our ongoing discussions, being open, being a resource for them. So when the legislative director had questions, I was just a phone call away. I made myself present. I actually went around the Capitol prior to everything and introduced myself as a person working for, as the peer policy fellow for Recovery People, and told them that I was a resource for them, resource of any type of information in my bandwidth, and it worked. So that's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that, Carl.
You're welcome.
Anybody else want to talk about their advocacy action plans and kind of the progress around that?
This is Sherry. This is U.S. stuff, which I know is a little bit off of our topic, but I set up a meeting and was able to actually meet with Congressman Michael Burgess in D.C. He met with us himself, and we went on behalf of TAAP. There was 10 of us from Texas. In his position as co-chair of the Health Subcommittee for Energy and Commerce, that committee was really the driving force with H.R. 6, the big opioid package that was signed into law last month. And so we saw him and did a photo op with him, and were able to meet with him just to really thank him for his role and his leadership in getting that stuff done.
Excellent.
Jason, this is Carl again. I did leave out the fact that on yesterday we circled back around, and I believe that was important. Once we got the okay that the bill was going, we went back to the offices and asked how we could support the bill as session goes forward, and we were given some directives on what we should do and what not, and the things we shouldn't do. I believe that's an important caveat in the conversation that we need to come back around.
And I don't, but Carl, there's so much background noise. It's really hard to hear what you said. If I think I heard you right, that something else that you wanted to highlight as a best practice is that you circled back with the legislators, and once they agreed, committed to sponsoring a bill, then it's super important to be working with that office to make sure that you're supporting them in the effort rather than doing something that would upset them or undermine their ability to.
Correct.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the time. We've got about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. I don't believe Jamie Edwards is on the line, but she emailed me yesterday. She is in Greg Bonin's district, which earlier we heard about Dennis Bonin, who's likely going to be the Speaker of the House. This is his brother, who's in a neighboring district. She's been working with him over the last year, understanding what recovery is. And so he's been a huge ally and is looking at what potential bills they could sponsor supporting recovery, specifically family recovery. And in addition, a family friend is Representative White. She grew up in Representative White's district, And so Representative White actually reached out to her to ask her for some advice around what type of legislation should be passed. So it's just a great example of how it's important to become resources for our legislators. And once you develop those relationships, then they start coming to us for ideas around what bills should be put forth. Well, we've got a little less than 5 minutes left. Does anybody have another report out, or are there any questions that folks would like to put forth? If not, I am trying to pull up my notes to see when the next webinar is. It's going to be December 19th. So let me put that up here in the meeting notes. So we've got December 19th, and then January 29th, and then February 27th are our next webinars. And then, of course, we've got Recovery Day at the Capitol, which is going to be March 6th. So please save those dates and be looking for emails from us around the next topics. And if there's particular topics that you want to hear during these webinars, please let us know. And so I wanted to ask the TAAP representatives and the ASAP representatives whether they would like to offer any kind of last-minute words before we sign off.
Kind you very much for doing all this, Jason. You did the heavy lifting on this one. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. This is kind of where my world has ended up as on a series of these kind of webinars. So it becomes more comfortable for me. So thank you. You're welcome. Well, with that,
I gotta run.
With that, thank you everybody for taking the hour, and we will catch up with you next time.
Now